At my brother's wedding, he announced, "At least my wife's family has money, unlike our broke parents." Everyone clapped. My father stood up. The music stopped. Then he said, "Interesting, because I'm the one who paid for this entire wedding." The champagne flute in my hand felt suddenly heavy. I watched the color drain from my brother Ethan's face as every single person in the ballroom turned to look at our father. The string quartet stopped mid-note. The bride, Vanessa, froze with her hand halfway to her mouth, her diamond engagement ring catching the light from the crystal chandeliers. My father stood at table 7, wearing the same navy suit he'd worn to my college graduation, the one he'd had tailored twice to make it last. His hands weren't shaking. His voice was steady, carrying across the room with the quiet authority of a man who had nothing left to lose. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the ice melting in someone's drink 3 tables away. I'd been sitting at the family table for the past hour, watching my brother's wedding reception unfold with a growing sense of unease that I couldn't quite name. Everything was perfect. Too perfect. The Ritz-Carlton ballroom in downtown Seattle, the imported French champagne, the custom Vera Wang dress that Vanessa had mentioned cost more than my annual rent, the 12-piece orchestra, the ice sculptures shaped like swans, the menu cards printed on actual gold leaf. My brother had spared no expense for his big day, and why would he? He was marrying into the Ashford family, one of the wealthiest real estate dynasties in the Pacific Northwest. Vanessa's father, Richard Ashford, owned half the commercial properties in Bellevue. Her mother, Patricia, sat on the boards of 3 major charities and the Seattle Symphony. This wedding was as much a merger as a marriage, and everyone knew it. But something about the whole evening had felt off to me from the moment I'd walked into the venue that morning for photos. Maybe it was the way Ethan had introduced our parents to Vanessa's relatives. "These are my parents, David and Susan," he'd said, his voice stripped of warmth or detail, as if they were strangers he'd just met. No stories about how Dad had worked double shifts at the factory for 30 years. No mention of how Mom had gone back to nursing school at 45 to help pay for our educations. Just their names, delivered with the enthusiasm of someone reading a phone book. Or maybe it was the seating arrangement. Our parents were at table 7, tucked in the back corner near the kitchen doors, while Vanessa's extended family occupied the prime tables near the dance floor. My aunt and uncle, my cousins, my grandmother who'd flown in from Arizona, all relegated to the periphery like afterthoughts. Meanwhile, Vanessa's third cousin, twice removed, sat at table 2. I'm Daniel, by the way. I'm 28, 3 years younger than Ethan, and I work as a civil engineer for the city of Seattle. Nothing glamorous, just roads and bridges and water systems, the infrastructure that keeps a city running. I live in a modest apartment in Fremont, drive a 10-year-old Subaru, and spend my weekends hiking or playing basketball with friends from college. I'm not wealthy, but I'm comfortable, stable, content with a life that doesn't require impressing anyone. Ethan and I had been close growing up, sharing a bedroom in our small house in Renton, playing on the same little league team, covering for each other when one of us stayed out past curfew. But something had changed in the last 5 years, ever since he'd landed his job at Ashford Development as a junior acquisitions manager and met Vanessa at a company retreat. He'd started wearing different clothes, expensive suits, Italian shoes, watches that cost more than our childhood home's mortgage payment. He'd traded his old pickup truck for a BMW. He'd moved from his apartment near the university to a condo in downtown Bellevue. And slowly, gradually, he'd started distancing himself from our family. Thanksgiving dinners became, maybe if I can make it. Sunday phone calls with Mom went from weekly to monthly to almost never. When I'd asked him about it once, he'd shrugged and said he was busy, that the corporate world demanded different priorities, that I wouldn't understand because I worked for the government. There was a new edge to his voice when he talked about our childhood, a dismissiveness that made me uncomfortable. "We grew up poor," he'd say, as if it was shameful. I'm not going to apologize for wanting something better. The wedding planning had been a nightmare, at least from what my mother had told me during our weekly phone calls. Vanessa's family had opinions about everything. The venue wasn't fancy enough. The flowers weren't rare enough. The guest list needed to be trimmed because some people just don't fit the aesthetic. My mother had cried on the phone when Ethan suggested that maybe it would be better if our grandmother didn't attend because she might say something embarrassing. My father had gone quiet, that dangerous quiet that meant he was angrier than words could express. In the end, our grandmother had come anyway because I'd driven down to Arizona and brought her back myself. Ethan had been furious, but what was he going to do? Turn away his own grandmother at the door? The rehearsal dinner the night before had been the first warning sign that something was deeply wrong. It was held at a private club that required membership approval and had a waiting list longer than most college admissions. Vanessa's father had stood up to give a toast about how proud he was to welcome Ethan into their family, about how Ethan was exactly the kind of ambitious, forward-thinking young man who represented the future of their company. Then he'd made a joke about how Ethan was a self-made man who'd pulled himself up by his bootstraps despite his humble beginnings. Everyone had laughed. Ethan had laughed. My mother's smile had frozen on her face. My father had stared at his plate and said nothing. After dinner, I'd cornered Ethan in the hallway outside the restrooms. "What the hell was that?" I'd demanded. "Humble beginnings? You made it sound like we grew up in poverty." Ethan had adjusted his tie, not meeting my eyes. We weren't exactly wealthy, Daniel. Dad worked in a factory. Mom was a nurse. We lived in a 1,200-square-foot house in Renton. That's not the same background as the Ashfords. I'd grabbed his arm. They sacrificed everything for us. Dad worked overtime for years to pay for your college. Mom went back to school so she could make more money to help with our expenses. They're not broke, Ethan. They're just not rich. There's a difference. He'd pulled away from me. You don't get it. This is my chance to be part of something bigger. Vanessa's family has connections, opportunities, wealth that we never had. I'm not going to apologize for wanting to rise above where we came from. The words had hit me like a slap. Rise above? I'd repeated. You mean rise above the people who raised you? The people who loved you before you had money or status or a fancy job? Ethan had looked at me then, really looked at me, and I'd seen something in his eyes that made my stomach turn. Shame. He was ashamed of our parents, of our childhood, of everything that had made him who he was. You wouldn't understand, he'd said finally. You're content to be ordinary. I'm not. Then he'd walked away, leaving me standing in that hallway feeling like I'd just lost my brother to someone I didn't recognize. Now, sitting at table 7 during the reception, watching Ethan and Vanessa cut their 5-tier cake and feed each other bites while cameras flashed, I'd tried to push down the anger that had been building since the rehearsal dinner. This was his wedding day. I was supposed to be happy for him. But then the toasts had started. Vanessa's maid of honor had given a sweet speech about love and friendship. Her father had talked about legacy and family dynasties, and then Ethan had taken the microphone. I want to thank everyone for being here tonight, he'd begun, his voice amplified through the ballroom's sound system. This is the most important day of my life, and I'm grateful to be surrounded by people who represent the life Vanessa and I are building together. He'd gone on, talking about his career, his future, his ambitions, and then he'd said it. I'm especially grateful to my new family, the Ashfords, for welcoming me with open arms and showing me what real success looks like. At least my wife's family has money, unlike our broke parents. He'd gestured toward table 7, where our parents sat. But that's okay because we all start somewhere, right? The guests had laughed. Actually laughed. Richard Ashford had raised his glass. Patricia had smiled indulgently. Vanessa had leaned into Ethan and kissed his cheek. And I'd sat there, frozen, watching my parents' faces as their son publicly humiliated them in front of 200 people. My mother's hands had tightened on her napkin. I'd seen her do that before, when she was trying not to cry. My father had set down his fork very carefully, his jaw clenched. And then, slowly, deliberately, he'd stood up. The movement had caught Ethan's attention mid-laugh. The microphone had slipped slightly in his hand. The music from the string quartet had faltered and stopped. Every conversation in the room had died. 200 pairs of eyes had turned to watch the man in the modest navy suit standing at table 7 in the back corner near the kitchen doors. My father had looked at Ethan across the expanse of the ballroom, across the distance that had grown between them over the past 5 years, and spoken in a voice that carried the weight of 30 years of factory work and sacrificed dreams and love that had been thrown back in his face. Interesting, he'd said, because I'm the one who paid for this entire wedding. The words hung in the air like smoke. Ethan's face had gone from flushed to pale in the span of a heartbeat. Vanessa had turned to him with confusion written across her features. Richard Ashford had set down his champagne glass. My father had remained standing, his posture straight, his expression calm. The Ritz-Carlton ballroom, he'd continued, $58,000. The catering for 200 guests, $23,000. The string quartet and the DJ, $8,000. Vanessa's wedding dress, $12,000. The flowers, the ice sculptures, the imported champagne, the gold leaf menu cards, all of it. Total cost, $137,000. Paid in full by David Mitchell, factory worker, 42 years at Boeing's Renton plant, retired last month with a pension he'd been saving since he was 23 years old. I felt my breath catch. $137,000. Our father had spent his entire retirement savings on Ethan's wedding. The wedding where Ethan had just called our parents, broke in front of everyone who mattered to his new life. My mother had tears streaming down her face now, but she wasn't trying to hide them anymore. She was looking at my father with an expression of exhausted resignation, like this was the confirmation of something she'd known was coming, but had hoped would never arrive. The truth. The ugly, undeniable truth about what their son had become. Ethan had found his voice, though it came out strangled. Dad, this isn't... You don't understand the context. My father had cut him off. I understand perfectly. You told these people that your parents are broke. You've spent the last year planning this wedding with Vanessa's family, letting them believe that they were doing you a favor by including you in their world, that you came from nothing, that you were ashamed of where you came from. Meanwhile, your mother and I liquidated our retirement account, sold the house we'd lived in for 35 years, and moved into a smaller apartment so we could give you the wedding you wanted. The room was so silent, I could hear my own heartbeat. Richard Ashford was staring at Ethan with an expression I couldn't quite read. Shock, maybe, or disgust. Vanessa had taken a step back from her new husband, her hand dropping from his arm. My father had pulled something from his jacket pocket. Papers. He'd held them up so the room could see. I have the receipts, he'd said. Every invoice, every payment confirmation, every wire transfer, all from accounts in David and Susan Mitchell's names. Not a single dollar from the Ashfords. Not a single dollar from Ethan. This entire event, this spectacle you've been using to impress your new family, was paid for by the broke parents you just mocked in front of 200 people. Ethan had opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came out. He looked like a fish drowning in air. Vanessa had turned to him. Is this true? Her voice was quiet, but sharp enough to cut. Did you tell me your parents couldn't afford to contribute to the wedding? Did you let my father pay for the rehearsal dinner and the honeymoon because you said your family didn't have money? Ethan had tried to take her hand. She'd pulled away. Vanessa, I can explain. It's complicated. I just didn't want you to think. He'd trailed off because there was no way to finish that sentence that didn't make him sound exactly like what he was. A liar and a coward. My father had carefully folded the papers and put them back in his pocket. Your mother wanted to tell you no, he'd said, his voice softer now but still carrying across the room. When you asked us to help pay for the wedding, she wanted to say we couldn't afford it. But I said yes, because you're our son, and I thought this was what you wanted, what would make you happy. I thought maybe if we gave you this perfect day, you'd remember where you came from, remember the people who raised you. I was wrong. He'd looked at my mother, who was standing now too, her napkin still clutched in her hands. We're leaving. Daniel, are you coming? I'd stood without thinking, my legs moving before my brain caught up. I'd grabbed my jacket from the back of my chair and walked to my parents' side. As we passed the other tables, I'd seen the faces of Vanessa's family and friends. Some looked shocked, some looked uncomfortable. Some looked satisfied, like they'd just witnessed drama worth gossiping about for months. We'd walked out through the kitchen doors because they were closer than the main entrance. The catering staff had frozen mid-task, holding trays and champagne bottles, watching us pass. None of them had said anything. What was there to say? My father had driven us to the apartment complex in Renton where my parents now lived, a modest two-bedroom place that was clean and comfortable, but about a quarter of the size of their old house. The house where Ethan and I had grown up, where we'd played in the backyard and done homework at the kitchen table and learned to ride bikes in the driveway. The house they'd sold to pay for a wedding where they'd been treated like embarrassing relatives to be hidden in the back corner. My mother had gone straight to the bedroom without a word. I'd heard the door close softly, then the muffled sound of crying. My father had sat down on the couch and stared at the wall for a long moment before speaking. I knew, he'd said finally. I knew he was ashamed of us. Your mother kept saying I was wrong, that Ethan was just busy, that he'd come around. But I knew. His voice had been empty, drained of emotion. I thought maybe if I gave him this, if I showed him we could do something grand, something that matched his new life, he'd realize we weren't an embarrassment, that we were worth keeping. He'd looked at me then. I was a fool. I'd sat down next to him. You're not a fool. You're a father who loves his son. Ethan's the fool. He threw away everything real for something shiny and hollow. We'd sat in silence for a while. Then my father had pulled out his phone and started scrolling through photos, pictures of Ethan as a kid, little league games, school plays, family vacations to the Oregon coast where we'd stayed in cheap motels and cooked hot dogs on the beach. Ethan grinning with a missing front tooth. Ethan in his high school graduation gown. Ethan and I with our arms around each other's shoulders, both of us muddy from a football game in the rain. He used to be such a good kid, my father had said quietly. What happened to him? I'd wished I had an answer, but I didn't. All I knew was that somewhere between childhood and adulthood, between our small house in Renton and his expensive condo in Bellevue, my brother had decided that the people who loved him weren't good enough for the life he wanted. He'd traded authenticity for status, family for connections, love for money, and in doing so, he'd destroyed the one thing money couldn't buy, his parents' trust and respect. The phone on the coffee table had started buzzing. Ethan's name flashed on the screen. My father had picked it up, looked at it for a moment, then declined the call. It had buzzed again, declined, again, declined. After the fifth call, my father had turned the phone off completely. My mother had emerged from the bedroom an hour later, her eyes red, but her voice steady. I'm making tea. Does anyone want some? We'd sat around their small dining table drinking tea and not talking about the wedding. Instead, we'd talked about other things. My mother's volunteer work at the community health clinic, my father's plans to do some consulting work for former colleagues, my latest project at the city, a new bridge design that I was actually excited about. Normal things, safe things, things that didn't involve the fact that our family had just imploded in front of 200 strangers at the Ritz-Carlton. I'd stayed the night, sleeping on their couch because I didn't want to leave them alone. At some point around 3 a.m, I'd heard my mother crying again, softer this time, and my father's voice murmuring something I couldn't make out. I'd stared at the ceiling and thought about Ethan, about whether he was in his luxury hotel suite with his new wife, or whether he was somewhere alone trying to figure out how to fix what he'd broken. I'd thought about calling him, demanding answers, making him explain himself. But what was the point? He'd made his choice. We'd all seen it. The next morning, I'd woken to find my mother in the kitchen making breakfast like it was any other Sunday. Pancakes, bacon, coffee. My father was reading the newspaper at the table. They were going through the motions of normalcy, but I could see the strain in the tight lines around my mother's mouth, the way my father kept staring at the same page without actually reading it. We'd eaten in near silence until my mother's phone rang. She'd looked at the screen and let it go to voicemail. Ethan again. 3 more calls came through during breakfast, all ignored. At 10:30, there was a knock on the door. My father had opened it to find Vanessa standing in the hallway, still wearing her wedding dress, but with a coat thrown over it. Her makeup was smeared, her hair was falling out of its elaborate updo, and she looked like she'd been crying for hours. "Mr. Mitchell," she'd said, her voice breaking. "Can I please come in? I need to talk to you." My father had stepped aside to let her in. She'd walked into the small living room and stood there awkwardly, this bride in her $12,000 dress looking completely out of place in my parents' modest apartment. "I didn't know," she'd said immediately, looking at my mother and father. "I swear to you, I didn't know that you paid for the wedding. Ethan told me that you couldn't contribute, that you were struggling financially, that my father was covering most of the costs. I never would have let him say those things if I'd known the truth." Tears had started streaming down her face again. "My father pulled the financial records this morning. He wanted to verify Ethan's story. When he saw that every payment came from your accounts, he confronted Ethan. They had a massive fight in the hotel lobby. Ethan tried to lie, tried to say there was some misunderstanding, but my father had the bank statements. There was no misunderstanding." My mother had gotten up and guided Vanessa to the couch. "Sit down. You're going to trip on that dress." Vanessa had collapsed onto the cushions, her wedding gown pooling around her like a white cloud. "I feel like such an idiot. Ethan and I have been together for 3 years. How did I not know he was capable of this? How did I not see it?" She'd looked at my parents with something like desperation. Did he ever love me? Or was I just a ticket to the life he wanted? My father had sat down in his chair across from her. "I think he loved the idea of you. The idea of being part of your family, of having access to your world. Whether he loved you as a person, I can't answer that." The words had been brutally honest, but Vanessa had nodded like she'd already suspected as much. "My father has cut him off," she'd said quietly. "No job, no connections, no access to the family business. He said he won't associate with someone who lies and manipulates their way into relationships." My mother agreed. They've basically exiled him from the family. I'd felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness at that news. Ethan had gotten exactly what he deserved, but it still hurt to think about. "What are you going to do?" I'd asked Vanessa. She'd twisted the wedding ring on her finger. "I don't know. We've been married for less than 24 hours and I already feel like I don't know my husband. How do you come back from something like this?" None of us had an answer for her. How did you come back from the kind of betrayal Ethan had committed? How did you rebuild trust after someone had publicly humiliated the people who raised them just to impress strangers? Vanessa had stayed for another hour, drinking tea and talking quietly with my mother. They'd discussed family and expectations and the difference between who people present themselves to be and who they actually are. Before she left, Vanessa had pulled an envelope from her coat pocket and handed it to my father. "Ethan gave this to me this morning. He asked me to give it to you. I haven't read it." My father had taken the envelope but hadn't opened it. He'd simply set it on the coffee table and thanked Vanessa for coming. After she left, we'd all stared at that envelope like it was a bomb that might explode at any moment. "Aren't you going to read it?" I'd finally asked. My father had shaken his head. "Not right now. Maybe not ever. I don't know if I want to hear his excuses." But my mother had picked up the envelope and opened it. She'd read the letter in silence, her expression unreadable. Then she'd handed it to my father without a word. He'd read it too, his jaw tightening with each line. Finally, he'd passed it to me. The letter was written in Ethan's handwriting, messy and rushed, on Ritz-Carlton stationery. It read, "Dad, Mom, I know I can't fix what I said. I know I hurt you in a way that can't be undone. I was wrong. I was ashamed of the wrong things. I was ashamed of the life we lived when I should have been ashamed of myself for not valuing it. You worked so hard to give me opportunities, and I repaid you by treating you like you were worthless. I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I am sorry. Ethan." I'd set the letter down on the coffee table. "He's sorry," I'd said flatly. "That's supposed to make it better?" My mother had looked at me with tired eyes. "No, but it's a start." My father hadn't said anything. He'd just picked up the letter, folded it carefully, and put it in his pocket next to the wedding receipts. The contrasts hadn't been lost on me. $137,000 in receipts. 1 page of apology. The math didn't add up. The following week had been a blur of phone calls and awkward conversations. Ethan had called me 6 times before I finally answered. "Daniel, I need to talk to you. Please." I'd met him at a coffee shop in Capitol Hill, neutral territory. He'd looked terrible. Unshaven, dark circles under his eyes, wearing jeans and a wrinkled shirt instead of his usual designer suits. "Vanessa's filing for annulment," he'd said as soon as I sat down. "Her lawyers are claiming fraud in the inducement. They're saying I misrepresented who I was and where I came from. They're probably right." I'd ordered a coffee and waited for him to continue. "I lost my job. Richard called the CEO and told him everything. They said they couldn't have someone with questionable ethics in a senior position. I have 2 weeks to clear out my office." He'd laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I spent 5 years building a career there, gone in one phone call." I'd taken a sip of my coffee. "You did this to yourself, Ethan. Every single consequence you're facing, you earned." He'd looked at me with something that might have been hope. "Can you talk to them? To Mom and Dad? Can you ask them to forgive me?" I'd set my cup down carefully. "Why would I do that? You publicly humiliated them. You lied to everyone about them. You took their retirement savings and used it to impress people who didn't care about you. Why should they forgive you?" Ethan's face had crumpled. "Because they're my parents. Because I'm their son. Doesn't that count for something?" "It counted for $137,000, I'd said. "It counted for 30 years of factory work and night shifts and overtime. It counted for every sacrifice they made so you could have opportunities they never had. You threw all of that away because you were ashamed. You don't get to ask for forgiveness just because you're finally facing consequences." I'd stood up to leave. "If you want forgiveness, you're going to have to earn it. And I have no idea how you'd even start." 3 weeks after the wedding, I'd gotten a call from a number I didn't recognize. "Is this Daniel Mitchell?" a woman's voice had asked. "Yes. Who's this?" I'd replied. "My name is Jennifer Kowalski. I'm a therapist specializing in family reconciliation, and your brother Ethan has asked me to facilitate a conversation between him and your parents. He listed you as someone who might be willing to participate." I'd been silent for a moment, processing. "Ethan's in therapy?" I'd finally asked. "He's been seeing me twice a week for the past 3 weeks, Jennifer had confirmed. "He's working through some significant issues around shame, family relationships, and identity. He's asked if your parents would be willing to attend a session with him. He understands if they say no." I'd told her I'd talk to my parents and get back to her. That evening, I'd driven to their apartment and relayed the message. My father's response had been immediate. "No." My mother had been more hesitant. "Maybe we should hear what he has to say. He is trying to get help." My father had looked at her with an expression of profound weariness. "Susan, he can get all the help he wants. That doesn't mean we have to participate in his healing process. He broke something. I don't know if it can be fixed." We'd talked about it for hours. My mother had argued that refusing to engage would just widen the divide. My father had argued that showing up would send the message that Ethan could hurt them and then expect immediate reconciliation if he just checked the right boxes. I'd stayed neutral, letting them work through it themselves. Eventually, my mother had worn my father down. "1 session," he'd agreed. "We'll go to 1 session, but I'm not making any promises." The therapy session had been scheduled for a Thursday afternoon at Jennifer Kowalski's office in Bellevue. She was maybe 50 years old with kind eyes and a calm demeanor that immediately put me at ease. Her credentials were displayed on the wall. PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Washington, 23 years in practice, specialization in family systems therapy. She'd explained the ground rules. Everyone would have a chance to speak without interruption. The goal was understanding rather than resolution, and anyone could call for a break if things became too intense. Ethan had been waiting in the conference room when we arrived. He'd stood up when we walked in, and I'd seen my mother's resolve waver for just a moment. He looked like he'd lost 15 pounds, his face gaunt and drawn. "Thank you for coming," he'd said quietly. My father had just nodded and sat down. For the first hour, Jennifer had guided the conversation, asking each of us to share our perspective on what had happened. Ethan had gone first, his voice shaking as he described the shame he'd felt about our middle-class background, the pressure he'd put on himself to fit into Vanessa's world, the lies that had snowballed until he couldn't see a way out. "I convinced myself that if I just pretended hard enough, I could become the person they wanted me to be," he'd said. "I thought if I erased where I came from, I could be accepted in a way that felt impossible if people knew the truth. I was wrong. I was so wrong." My mother had cried quietly through his explanation. My father had remained stone-faced. Then it had been their turn. My mother had talked about the hurt of watching Ethan distance himself, of feeling like she'd lost her son to a world that valued money over character. My father had been more direct. "You made me feel worthless," he'd said, his voice steady but filled with pain. "You took everything I'd worked for, everything I'd sacrificed, and you treated it like it was shameful, like I was shameful. I gave you my retirement, Ethan. I gave you 35 years in a house I loved, and you repaid me by calling me broke in front of strangers. I don't know how to forgive that." The room had gone silent. Jennifer had let the silence sit for a moment before speaking. "Ethan, what do you need from your parents?" He'd looked at them with eyes full of tears. "I need them to know I'm sorry. I need them to know that I understand what I did and why it was wrong. I need them to know that I'm trying to be better." Jennifer had turned to my parents. And what do you need from Ethan? My mother had spoken first. I need to believe that this is real. That you're not just sorry because you lost your job and your wife. That you genuinely understand the damage you caused. My father had added, I need time. I need to see that you've changed before I can trust you again. The session had ended with no resolution, just an agreement to keep trying. Jennifer had suggested monthly check-ins, and surprisingly, my parents had agreed. Over the next 6 months, we'd met regularly. Slowly, painfully, Ethan had started to rebuild trust. He'd gotten a new job, a much more modest position at a small engineering firm. He'd moved out of his expensive condo and into a studio apartment. He'd sold the BMW and bought a used Mazda. He'd started volunteering at a nonprofit that provided job training to low-income communities. He was rebuilding his life from the ground up, trying to become someone his parents could be proud of again. But the real turning point had come 9 months after the wedding. Ethan had asked to meet with just me for coffee. When I'd arrived, he'd handed me a folder. What's this? I'd asked. Payment plan, he'd said. I'm going to pay back every dollar Dad spent on the wedding. It's going to take me years, probably a decade, but I'm going to do it. I've already made the first payment, $500. It's not much, but it's a start. I'd opened the folder to see a detailed spreadsheet breaking down the $137,000 into manageable monthly payments, along with a copy of a cashier's check made out to our father. You don't have to do this, I'd said. Ethan had shaken his head. Yes, I do. He gave me his retirement. The least I can do is try to give it back. I'd looked at my brother, really looked at him, and seen something I hadn't seen in years. Humility, genuine regret, the willingness to make amends not through words, but through action. I'll make sure he gets it, I'd said. That evening, I'd driven to my parents' apartment and given my father the folder. He'd read through it in silence, his expression unreadable. Then he'd set it down and looked at me. Tell him I appreciate the gesture, he'd said finally. Tell him I'll accept the payments, and tell him that every month he makes a payment, he's welcome to come to Sunday dinner. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was an open door, a path forward. Over the next 2 years, Ethan had never missed a payment, and he'd never missed a Sunday dinner. Slowly, carefully, he'd rebuilt his relationship with our parents. The conversations were awkward at first, stilted and formal, but they became easier with time. My mother had started calling him during the week again. My father had started asking about his work. I'd started seeing glimpses of the brother I'd grown up with, the one who'd been buried under ambition and shame. Vanessa's annulment had gone through 6 months after the wedding. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd moved to New York for a fresh start. I hoped she'd found happiness. She'd deserved better than what Ethan had given her. Meanwhile, Ethan had started dating someone new. Her name was Lauren, and she was a middle school teacher who drove a 15-year-old Toyota and lived in a small apartment in Ballard. She was kind, down to earth, and completely uninterested in status or wealth. She was exactly what Ethan needed. The first time he'd brought her to Sunday dinner, I'd watched my parents' reaction carefully. My mother had liked her immediately. My father had been more reserved, but by the end of the evening, I'd seen him smile at something Lauren had said. It was a start. 4 years after the wedding that had destroyed our family, Ethan had finally paid off the last installment of his debt, $137,000, paid back in monthly increments that had required sacrifice and discipline and commitment. My father had framed the final check and hung it in his home office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A reminder that people could change, that regret could be transformed into action, that broken things could sometimes be repaired. Ethan had asked me to come with him when he delivered that final payment in person. We'd driven to our parents' apartment together, and I'd waited in the car while he went inside. I'd watched through the window as he'd handed the check to our father, as our father had pulled him into a hug that Ethan had probably needed for years. When he'd come back to the car, he'd been crying. He said he was proud of me, Ethan had told me. He said I'd become the man he always knew I could be. I'd put a hand on his shoulder. You earned that, Ethan. You really did. Now, 6 years after that disastrous wedding at the Ritz-Carlton, I stood in a much simpler venue watching Ethan get married for the second time. The ceremony was in a community center in Renton, the same neighborhood where we'd grown up. There was no orchestra, no ice sculptures, no imported champagne, just family, close friends, simple decorations, and genuine love. Lauren wore a dress she'd bought off the rack for $300. Ethan wore the same navy suit our father had worn to my college graduation, the one Dad had given him as a gift. Our parents sat in the front row, holding hands and smiling. When the officiant asked if anyone objected to the marriage, I'd held my breath for just a moment, remembering another wedding where everything had gone wrong. But this time, there was only silence. Happy silence. The kind that comes when everyone present genuinely wants the couple to succeed. During his vows, Ethan had looked at our parents. I want to thank the 2 people who taught me what real love looks like. My parents, who showed me that the best things in life aren't things at all. They're the people who stand by you even when you don't deserve it, who believe in you even when you've given them every reason not to, who love you not for what you have, but for who you are. My mother had cried. My father had nodded, his jaw tight with emotion. And I'd realized that this was the wedding Ethan should have had the first time. Simple, honest, surrounded by people who knew him and loved him anyway. At the reception, which was held in the same community center with catered food from a local restaurant and music from a Bluetooth speaker, our father had stood to give a toast. "I'm not good with speeches," he'd begun, "but I want to say that I'm proud of my son. Not for what he's achieved or how much money he makes or who his in-laws are. I'm proud of him because he made mistakes, faced the consequences, and chose to be better. That takes courage. That takes character. Welcome to the family, Lauren. You're getting a good man, one who's learned that the most important things can't be bought." The guests had applauded. Ethan had wiped his eyes, and Lauren had smiled at him with such genuine affection that I'd felt a surge of hope for both of them. Later, when the dancing had started and people had loosened up, I'd found myself talking with my father at one of the tables. "Do you think he's really changed?" I'd asked. My father had watched Ethan spinning Lauren around the small dance floor, both of them laughing. "I think he's trying to change every day. That's all anyone can do." "Do you forgive him?" I'd pressed. My father had been quiet for a long moment. "I'm working on it. Forgiveness isn't a destination, Daniel. It's a process. Some days are easier than others. But I see him trying, and that matters." He'd paused. The money was never the point. I could have lived without the retirement savings. What hurt was the shame. The feeling that we weren't good enough for his new life. But he's shown me that he understands that now. He's shown me through his actions, not just his words. That's what I needed. I'd looked around the room at this simple celebration, at the people who'd shown up to support Ethan and Lauren, at the community center that was probably 1% of the cost of the Ritz-Carlton, and I'd realized something. This was worth more than that first wedding could ever have been, because this was real. This was built on truth instead of lies, on love instead of ambition, on character instead of status. 6 years ago, my brother had destroyed his family for a wedding that looked perfect, but was hollow. Today, he was building a new family based on everything he should have valued from the beginning. As the evening wound down and guests started leaving, Ethan had pulled me aside. "Thank you for not giving up on me," he'd said. "When everyone else would have been justified in walking away, you stayed. You and Mom and Dad. I don't know if I deserved that chance." I'd looked at my brother, at the man he'd become through years of hard work and humility and genuine change. "You're right. You didn't deserve it. But that's what family means. We don't love each other because we're perfect. We love each other despite our imperfections. You just needed to remember that." Now, driving home from the reception, I thought about everything that had happened since that terrible moment at the Ritz-Carlton, when our father had stood up and exposed the truth. How Ethan had lost everything, his job, his wife, his status, his identity. How he'd spent years rebuilding not just his life, but his character. How our family had slowly, painfully, found its way back to something resembling wholeness. It wasn't the same as before. You couldn't erase that kind of betrayal, but it was something real, something earned through accountability and time and consistent effort. My phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. "Thank you for being there today. It meant everything." I'd texted back, "Always, brother, always." And I'd meant it, because despite everything that had happened, despite the pain and the anger and the years of rebuilding trust, he was still my brother. The person I'd shared a bedroom with, played Little League with, covered for when he'd stayed out past curfew. He'd lost his way for a while, seduced by a world that valued surface over substance. But he'd found his way back, not to where he'd been, but to somewhere better, somewhere honest. 6 years after my brother's first wedding, where he'd called our parents broke, and our father had revealed he'd paid for everything, I'd learned something important about family, forgiveness, and the long road to redemption. I'd learned that people could change if they were willing to do the work. I'd learned that actions mattered more than words. I'd learned that the most valuable things in life weren't the ones you could put a price tag on. And I'd learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was stand up and tell the truth, even when it was painful, even when it cost you everything, even when you weren't sure anyone would listen. My father had stood up at that wedding and changed everything with one sentence. He'd exposed Ethan's lies, destroyed his carefully constructed image, and forced everyone in that ballroom to see the truth. It had been brutal. It had been necessary. And it had ultimately been the catalyst for Ethan becoming someone worth respecting again. Sometimes love looks like a hug. Sometimes it looks like standing up and saying, "Interesting, because I'm the one who paid for this entire wedding." Both are necessary. Both are valid. Both are what family does. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.